Welcome. I'm Ben Olinsky, the Vice President for Structural Reform and Governance here at CAP, and a co-author of a new joint report with Governing for Impact that offers a roadmap for additional executive action on artificial intelligence, or AI. Thank you for joining us in person or online for today's event. For those joining virtually, closed captioning is available using the captioning button, and you can submit your questions for our panelists using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. Last year, as the buzz about AI was reaching a fever pitch, we kept hearing the same phrases over and over. Existing laws apply to AI. Utilize the laws on the books. Maximize existing authorities. A few agencies like the Federal Trade Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau had begun to examine their authorities and speak about how to apply existing laws to these new technologies. But they were the exception. Little research had been done on how existing authorities might be leveraged. We did find inspiration in an unlikely place, a 2020 Trump administration memo requesting agencies to detail all of the laws they enforce that could be used to regulate AI. Unfortunately, only the Department of Health and Human Services publicly responded to this request. But that response, which listed 11 relevant laws and how they could address AI, served as a helpful template for us. Around the same time, we connected with the nonprofit Governing for Impact, which had been looking into similar questions. We are thrilled to have joined forces with them to produce our new report, and they have been a remarkable partner in this endeavor. You'll hear from their executive director, Rachel Klarman, at the conclusion of this event, but I want to express my deep gratitude and appreciation to her and her team. Our joint report contains over 80 recommendations for the White House, the Department of Labor, Department of Education, housing regulators, and financial regulators. In each section, it systematically identifies the likely risks from AI, the key laws that can be used by agencies, and specific recommendations for using those authorities. Our report is meant to be a menu of recommendations to be further examined and developed into future action. The Biden-Harris administration issued a sweeping executive order on AI in November of last year, and its implementation is critical to efforts to address AI. We hope our report helps identify some next steps for them to take in implementing the order and crafting future ones. I want to be clear. While our recommendations can make a real difference, they do not replace the need for Congress to act and pass comprehensive new legislation to regulate AI. But agencies cannot and should not wait to utilize the powers they already have. We're thrilled to begin with a discussion from two of our nation's leading policymakers and two individuals for whom I have deep, deep respect. Rohit Chopra is the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, a U.S. government agency dedicated to ensuring you are treated fairly by banks, lenders, and other financial institutions. He's a member of the board of directors of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation and the Financial Stability Oversight Council. Director Chopra had previously served as a commissioner on the Federal Trade Commission after having been unanimously confirmed by the Senate. Dr. Alondra Nelson is a distinguished senior fellow here at CAP, and this week she announced the launch of the Science, Technology, and Social Values Lab at the Institute of Advanced Studies, where she is the Harold F. Linder Professor. From 2021 until 2023, Dr. Nelson was Deputy Assistant to the President and Principal Deputy Director for Science and Society at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. She also served as Acting Director, becoming the first African American and the first woman of color to lead U.S. science and technology policy. Please join me in welcoming Director Chopra and Dr. Nelson to the stage.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. So, Director Chopra, thank you, Ben, for that introduction. Congratulations to the CAP and the Governing for Impact teams on the release of this report, which is fantastic, actually, and I commend to all of you and hope that you'll take a look at it. So, Director Chopra, last time we were together to talk about AI policy, it was at the White House. It was October of 2022. It was a month before ChatGPT had taken over the world with fear and awe. We were releasing the blueprint, the White House blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which has sort of 5, principles with practices, including red teaming and auditing for how we might begin to think about governing AI, both on the level of principles and the level of practice. I think lesser known about that moment was that the AI Bill of Rights was also released with the White House fact sheet. And the fact sheet included commitments and some highlighting of work that was already taking place in government. And it was very much focused on what could be done now. And I'm just going to read the commitment from that fact sheet from your bureau, from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I'm quoting here. Again, October 2022, CFPB has confirmed that federal anti-discrimination law requires that creditors provide consumers with specific and accurate explanations when credit applications are denied or other adverse actions are taken, even if the creditor is relying on a black box credit model using complex algorithms. CFPB is also cracking down on algorithmic discrimination in the financial sector and hiring technologists to fully staff this oversight work. So a lot of what you describe here would become the cornerstone of the kind of Biden-Harris strategy as we see in the president executive order. And CFPB was clearly very early to AI governance, in part because algorithms have existed in the space that you regulate for so long. But why in addition was CFPB so early? I mean, can you say a little bit about the strategy that you were beginning to roll out when you took leadership at CFPB, and then how you continue to sort of exercise your leadership and your authorities in the space of AI regulation?
Well, thank you so much again, and really to all the organizers. I think really to get to Dr. Nelson's question, is to rewind a little bit. The CFPB is, of course, formed in the wake of a horrific financial crash in the mortgage markets that was largely because regulators were just totally out to lunch and not really holding people accountable. But actually, in the law that created the CFPB, it's not just mortgages and credit cards we regulate. We also have responsibility for a law that is one of the only cross-sectoral laws when it comes to regulating data, and that's the Fair Credit Reporting Act. That's not just Equifax, Experian, TransUnion, it's every single background report trafficking data being sold about us. And there was nothing that more squarely aligned with some of the challenges we were facing with intrusive surveillance, weaponization of data, and really algorithms on steroids. So I think we thought to ourselves, there's a lot of sparkly acronyms. And we always think about AI sometimes as just a marketing term to juice your valuation of a company. In reality, some of this stuff has been around for a while. The FICO score. I mean, we have had these issues for ages. So I think we thought to ourselves, we are not going to just stand on the sidelines and be out to lunch. We're going to build capabilities internally, led by our chief technologist, Erie Meyer, who has had so much experience across government on this. We're going to use the tools we have to safeguard both privacy, civil rights, and that really meant being robust when it comes to being crystal clear. There is no fancy technology exemption from our civil rights and fair lending laws. And really, that's what we've been doing. And we've had a lot of impact in the markets that way.
It's quite a powerful example because there's a way in which CFPB models, I think, for government and for governance, like, not getting caught up in the shiny object of the technology, because as you said, some version of this technology has existed in this space for a long time. Okay, so going back to October 2022, when you make this announcement in this White House fact sheet, one of the things you announce under the leadership of Erie Meyer, who you've just mentioned, is bringing technologists into your agency. And now that has become a principal strategy. It's a big part of the Biden-Harris, President Biden's executive orders about this kind of AI talent surge. So why were you and how are you thinking about that so early on? Are there particular types of technologists you need for CFPB that you might differently from different agencies? And how is that recruitment going?
Yeah, so there's been a few places that we've been pretty obsessed with looking at. What are the legal authorities to bring in people with technical talent to not just be part of the traditional sort of functions when with people who think about technology, but who can be in on the investigations, asking, writing up the subpoena for what to turn over? Who's in looking at the models that financial institutions are using to underwrite credit? Who's really diving deep into user experience and how to make government work better? Who's looking at the use of generative AI and documenting how it is taking over aspects of customer service? I think we've seen that standing up this function is also changing the culture. It's not just about lawyers having academic debates. It's about looking what's being used in the market, where the investors pouring capital into, who's juicing their valuations that way, and what are we going to do about it? One of the things that's really exciting right now, we're taking advantage of various new authorities under the Office of Personnel Management's regulations to bring in technical talent that are critical for the work. We're also leading efforts to do what's called pooled hiring, where we're able to solicit applicants, not just for us, but for other agencies too, to create a new core in the United States of people with technical skills who want to serve government. And boy, do we have so many people who come to us and say, I'm kind of sick of the culture in some of these big tech companies and others who are just trying to steal people's data to monetize it. I want to use these skills really to make my country better. And I think that's very inspiring for them as well.
Excellent. Well, we're all hoping that you succeed in that. So let's talk about data. It's come up a few times, and particularly the special authorities that you have kind of cross-sectoral, as you said, around data. It's clearly one of the kind of sort of infrastructural things that we need to do to get a handle on social media, to get a handle on AI governance. We have tried along with privacy for over a decade to get a handle on these things, and we've not quite been able to. There's obviously some federal private data protection and data legislation that we are hoping might be successful. But even without that legislation, you have authorities in that space. So I wanted to ask you about data brokers, which has become an industry that's expanded since the formation of your agency, and how you're thinking about that. And related to that, the implications for national security, right? So that part of, to the extent that we've had been able to constrain data flows at all or get any purchase on them, it's been in the national security space and sort of thinking about places where American data, quote unquote, should and shouldn't go.
Yeah, I was involved in the investigation of the data breach at Equifax. And one of the things that was very striking to everybody was that this was not necessarily a breach for the purpose of stealing someone's identity. But when we look Equifax, Marriott, OPM, the list goes on and on, we see many of these intrusions were allegedly done by state actors or others who are using it to collect and assemble dossiers about Americans for statecraft purposes. I think there's really a change in consensus about when it comes to just massive data collection now, which is that the harms when it falls into hands of adversaries can be used for extortion, manipulation, and more. We have seen the intrusive collection of information about U.S. service members, others involved in the diplomatic corps. So one of the things that was really interesting about a recent executive order that President Biden issued, it's about national security, but it encourages the CFPB to very aggressively look at its authorities when it comes to regulating this underworld of data brokers. These data brokers are being used for all sorts of purposes, including as stalkerware, including as ways to track people, and they are a purveyor of how that information could be fed into foundational AI models that will ultimately form the basis for so many of the decisions made about our lives. So we will be proposing rules in the upcoming months to make sure that those data brokers are complying with the Fair Credit Reporting Act of 1970, which includes some very clear restrictions on the permissible purposes of collecting and sharing and selling that type of data. We think this is very important to make sure that the spirit of our long-standing data protection laws are holding true in the digital age and beyond.
Well, we will certainly be looking for that in the next couple of months. So Vice President Harris gave a speech at the U.S. Embassy in London, in which she took up the conversation of existential risk, and was very, I think, articulate and adamant and suggesting that there are risks to people that are existential, that are happening every day right now, harms and risks. And part of what she mentioned, and this was your last answer to the last question was taking me there, was about scams and frauds, particularly to vulnerable communities, to seniors. How are you thinking about, I mean, fraud falls under the purview of what you do at CFPB. How are you thinking about how that's being exacerbated with AI? And what are the particular things that CFPB or other agencies can do in that space?
Yeah, we have a pretty bad culture in America when it comes to talking generally about victims of fraud. We use words like sucker, rube, we are big in our culture in terms of shaming victims. But the reality is that we now live in a society where people's core identifying markers, their voice, their face, and so much more are being cut and pasted and weaponized. And so we are seeing a big uptick in various types of financial fraud, including people pretending to be a family member, pretending to be a boss, pretending to be someone with real authenticity around it. So I think we administer a really important law, the Electronic Fund Transfer Act, which really sets the bounds for how financial fraud occurs and where consumers have rights to dispute when their credentials, their identity has been stolen. And I think we're going to need to continue to make sure the financial industry is really keeping up with this and that we're not letting our guard down about it.
So I would love to, let's talk more about the financial industry and about banking in particular. We had fairly recently in Silicon Valley, a bank that failed, the Silicon Valley Bank failed. And I think it's not unreasonable. I think Senator Warner is concerned about this, that AI is going to exacerbate these kinds of systemic risks to the financial sector and to banking, with the sort of implications of that and the harms of that really trickling down to everyday people, not trickling up to moving up to industry. How are you, thinking about that, the terms of banking crashes when it comes to emerging technologies and the way that AI more generally is sort of, and other related tools and systems are changing the financial ecosystem?
Yeah, so 15 months ago, Silicon Valley Bank failed very, very rapidly. There was a lot of discussion about, well, the failure was partially due to Twitter, and there was all sorts of things about speed of communication. But there's also so much built in to algorithms and AI that might lead to automated decision making that is even faster than really normal human processing. We saw this in certain types of flash crashes many years ago with high frequency algorithmic trading. One of the things I'm really glad the report showcases is really these systemic financial risk issues that can crash the whole economy. So I think about it in a couple of ways. One is really the dependence of the financial system on the cloud. And those cloud providers are going to be the same guys as the foundational AI models. And to what extent is cloud and AI going to create huge vulnerabilities that we need to address? I'm glad the report mentions that there's existing tools on the books to potentially designate them as systemically important utilities, for which would give the agencies a lot more tools to make sure we safeguard that. I'd also say we have to really be constantly thinking about what are the ways in which there can be herding effects. When there's only a couple of underlying formulas or models, does that lead the entire market to herd in one direction and maybe crash and burn a lot in its way? And we saw how 15 months ago that led to the public backstopping and taking emergency actions. We need to make sure we're not in that position when it comes to AI. And I hope people look at this report about the tools, the laws on the books to act now. The Financial Stability Oversight Council should not be a book report club. It should be just doing more than just writing about risks, but doing things about it as well.
So we've got time for one last question, and then I would love for you to make any final remarks that you'd like to. You make it seem so easy, right? You've worked at FTC before, CFPB, but it takes a particular kind of creativity. You've got to know the laws, you've got to know the history of an agency to do the kind of policy innovation that you're actually doing and that you've been doing for many years in the context of a kind of swirling dynamic of changing technology and emerging technology. And to your earlier point, with lots of hype because people are juicing valuations and other things. And so you are a person of action and not a philosophy, but I want to, like, if you had to talk about your kind of theory of change or theory of the case for how you think about the space of new and emerging technologies and the role of a regulator in that dynamic space, how would you kind of sum that up?
Yeah, I think the great technological change has the potential to dramatically improve the condition of individuals and families. We have seen too many examples of where it just concentrates power in a click and ultimately is used to weaponize. And I think we encourage at the CFPB for our folks to approach it with skepticism, with asking tough questions, and knowing the laws that we have been entrusted to, whether it's broad things like data brokers or narrow issues. In a few days, we're going to be publishing a new rule on AI and algorithmic home appraisals. We have to think about all of the individual small pieces and the big pieces together. But I think, Alondra, we also see this as an all of government effort. We play one role and you played a big role in herding the cats to actually get stuff done. So I'm done with stewing and thinking and exploring. It's now time to act and act quickly because we saw with subprime mortgage lending, it was called an innovation. It was called something that was going to improve everyone. And then it destroyed the lives of people across the country because people weren't skeptical and they refused to use the laws on the books. And I think that's just where we need to be.
Well, Director Rohit Chopra, thank you for your leadership and for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. We're now going to hear from my colleague, Adam Connor.
We really appreciate it. My name is Adam Connor, and I am the Vice President of Technology Policy at the Center for American Progress and the co-author of the new report with Governing for Impact, Taking Further Agency Action on AI. I am thrilled today to be joined by three all-star panelists and executive directors of outstanding partner organizations, Rachel Klarman, Mary Beth MB Maxwell, and Janet Haven, who I'll welcome to the stage now. I will start with introductions so we know who it is. To my right is Rachel Klarman, is the Executive Director of Governing for Impact. Prior to GFI, she was a legal policy analyst at Democracy Forward, where she identified and developed litigation challenging the Trump administration's actions regarding healthcare, labor, and education. She's worked on a number of electoral and issue campaigns, including as Deputy Chief of Staff on Tom Perriel's gubernatorial campaign and as the National Director of Young American Outreach at Enroll America. Rachel is a native of Charlottesville, Virginia, and holds a JD cum laude from Harvard Law School and BA from the University of Virginia. Mary Beth MB Maxwell is to Rachel's right. MB is the Executive Director of Workshop, and during the Obama administration, MB served in numerous roles at the Labor Department, including Senior Advisor to the Secretary, Acting Administrator of the Wage and Hours Division, and Acting Assistant Secretary for Policy. She also worked in the White House as a detail lead of Vice President Biden's middle class task force. MB played leadership roles in the home care rule, the overtime rule, the LGBT executive order, minimum wage, and paid leave. During the Biden transition, she served on the personnel team recruiting and vetting new DOL staff. MB was the National Field Director for Jobs with Justice and the founding director of the labor think tank American Rights at Work. She most recently worked at the Open Society Foundation's as Senior Advisor on Worker Power. And finally, to her right is Janet Haven, the Executive Director of Data and Society. She's worked at the intersection of technology policy, governance, and accountability for more than 20 years, both domestically and internationally. Janet is a member of the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee, or NIAC, I believe, which advises President Biden and the National AI Initiatives Office on a range of issues related to AI. In 2024, she became an appointed AI expert for the UN Secretary General's high-level advisory body on AI. She's also a member of the Partnership on AI's Philanthropy Steering Committee and brought her expertise in nonprofit governance to various board memberships. Before joining Data and Society, Janet spent more than a decade at the Open Society Foundations, overseeing funding strategies and worldwide grant making related to technology, human rights, and governance, and played a substantial role in shaping the emerging international field focused on technology and accountability. She began her career in technology startups in Central Europe and lived in the region for more than 15 years. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to Director Chopra and for Dr. Nelson for those early remarks. I want to start with a question for everyone, and maybe I'll start with Rachel, which is, as executive directors of 3 different organizations, could you give our audience a little background on your organization and how you might be thinking about AI's intersection with your organization's work?
Sure. Thank you all so much for being here. This report has been a real labor of love, and it's so exciting to see it out in the world. I'm Rachel Klarman. I'm the Executive Director of Governing for Impact. We are a relatively new nonprofit. We were founded in 2019, and we have a small team of people all trained as lawyers, and we focused on regulatory policy development. So only on actions that the administration can take. And we try to focus our work on areas where we think that legal analysis early on in the policy development can make a difference between the administration acting or not acting. So we became really interested in AI for a few reasons. I think the first is it's obviously a pressing policy issue where it doesn't seem likely that we will get imminent congressional action. And so the best avenue to make real progress is through executive action. And then the second reason is there are a lot of sort of legal issues around using agency action to tackle AI. And I think in particular in the current judicial environment where we have a Supreme Court who has specifically said that they are skeptical of agencies using old statutes to address new problems, we think that any policies that try to tackle AI really need to be grounded in statutory authority and have sort of strong basis in legal analysis behind them. And so that's sort of how we came to this issue.
Great. This is on. Yeah. Thanks to CAP and GFI for hosting this event. And it's so great to be on this panel together. And this report is amazing. Like, I am geeking out on all of the very, very detailed options for action and the sub-regulatory details of it. This is what's usually missing for advocates that are trying to engage in executive action. And what you're in effect doing is democratizing this insider information that helps more people access the process of executive action. So that's kind of my segue to Workshop. So Workshop is a small team of former Obama and Biden appointees who work on workers' rights and labor policy. And from our experience of being inside government, we know that appointees and career staff, because no policy gets done without a ton of career staff working their hearts out on something, are drinking from a fire hose and rarely have the time to go through all of the details and the innovation. They need advocates on the outside to be bringing them ideas, to be putting pressure on the outside to make change happen, to be bringing real people impacted by the issues to policymaking. But too often, advocates have a hard time understanding what's happening inside that black box of the White House or government agencies, or what is that sub-regulatory language? Like, it can really feel like a foreign language. And so that's a big part of what we do at Workshop, is helping appointees on the inside and advocates on the outside. How can we all get our game up and have a bigger impact for workers? So now you can tell why I'm like so excited about this report, because you guys are making a huge difference on that. Specifically on AI and workers, I would make 3 points. First, and this just acknowledging the work of Michelle Miller at Harvard and Molly Kinder at Brookings and David Weil, the author of The Fissured Workplace, is that, what is new about AI and what is not new at all about AI? And I think this harkens to Director Chopra's point in the financial industry. AI is just part of a continuum. There is a lot of this that is as old as the hills. 10 years ago, we were all shocked by Uber and Lyft and algorithmic management, or what was happening to Amazon workers in warehouses, right? But companies and corporations finding new ways to shed responsibility for labor standards, to say someone is not a worker and so they're not affected by the current laws, to claim that data is a trade secret and so they can't share information. These are all very old playbooks, right? So this part about AI is not new at all. And we should not act like it is, and we should look at these other generations of enforcing labor standards. The second, though, is that I think all of us have to center workers when we're looking at the impacts of AI. Workers, people, are creating AI. It relies on the work of other people. It extracts work from work already done. We need to visibilize the workers in AI. Our language even, right, makes it seem like there's no people involved in this. It's not true. I was at this incredible forum at the Institute for the Future on Future of Work like 10 years ago, and they were showing this amazing app where you could like scan a picture of a plant, and this app, because of the amazing algorithms, could tell you the name of this plant. And the truth was there were workers working in a sweatshop in the Philippines who were finding the answers or proofing the answers. And that's happening a lot in even the AI we're seeing right now. So we need to visibilize the workers that are in it. We also need to acknowledge so many of the places where we're seeing the impacts are the workplace. Workplaces are being profoundly disrupted by AI. It's replacing work, it's using, or some would say stealing work, it's surveilling work, it's creating new work, it's extracting data from workers. And there's a black box around all of it, controlling and hiding information about the conditions of employment, and eclipsing and obscuring the employment relationship. And this is one of the best things about the report is there's so many places where you guys are specifically saying, this is the data and the transparency that this enforcement agency needs to be able to enforce its laws. The last I would just say is that we have to center workers in the solution. And I'll just lift up the incredibly successful writer strike. Like they were facing existential threat. Will we as writers and even actors be replaced, be mimicked? And it was through a union strike, insisting on transparency, insisting on consent, that they would have some say about how AI was used, insisting on having a seat at the table, that they actually won one of our first big victories on how AI will be used. So we need workers front and center in this. Thanks.
Thank you, Janet.
Yeah, thanks. Is this on? Yes. Hi, everyone. Janet Haven. Thank you, Adam, and thank you to CAP and to GFI for putting out this amazing report. It is, I am also nerding out on it right now. I really recommend reading it. It is really the report we need right now, particularly as we're seeing the lack of action from Congress on AI legislation. And so we really need to look back to agencies' existing powers to bring about a regulatory environment for AI that is meaningful and accountable and actually works to shift power. So I'm very, very grateful for the report, and thank you for having me. Thank you all for being here. So I run a research institute called Data and Society. We are an independent nonprofit organization. We study the social and cultural and political impacts and implications of data-centric technologies and increasingly AI. We've been around for 10 years. I'll just give you a bit of an example of the kind of work that we've done. So in 2017, we decided to start a research program called AI on the Ground. And the thinking behind that was that we were starting to see the rollout of AI systems in very normal, boring situations, like in retail, in agriculture, in all kinds of places. And there was a lot of hype around how these systems were going to fix things, were going to supercharge industry, et cetera. But there was very, very little understanding about how those technologies were actually interacting with the people who were using them, how they were changing workflows on the ground, how people were gaming them or ignoring them or resisting them. And so that's a core approach that we take at Data and Society, is to be asking that question about the point of intersection between people and society. And one of the key realizations that we had as that program got underway was that this was really, really critical evidence, really critical information to feed into policymaking, that we really could not come up with a way to govern these technologies, to govern AI, without understanding the ways in which they interact with people and people interact with them. And so that really led us in around 2020 to launch a policy program alongside our research program. So at this point, we have a range of research areas. We also work on labor. That was such a great summary, MB. We also work on labor futures, on the impacts of these systems on workers now, and how it is changing work, and the ways that we need to build governance to shift worker power. But we take that knowledge, that evidence from our research, and use it to help inform human-centered governance. And that's really, really the focus of our work at Data and Society. I also sit on the NIAC, the National NIAC, not a town in New York, the National AI Advisory Committee to the White House. And on that committee, I co-chair the Rights, Trust, and Safety Working Group. And so the way that the NIAC works is really through the process of developing consensus recommendations and findings that we, as a committee, then share with the White House. And one of the ones that I just wanted to mention that we've worked on over the past 6 months has focused on the issue of AI safety. AI safety has been one of the more contentious issues, I would say, in the discussions around AI governance. And the point of contention, to some extent, is how broad or how broadly or narrowly we should define safety, whether we should think of it as existential risk that is far out that we need to deal with largely through technical evaluations, or whether we should be thinking of AI safety as a more immediate set of harms and a more immediate set of concerns, again, grounded in the experience that people are having now. And so the NIAC decided to do a deep dive into that question of how the US government should approach this issue of AI safety, particularly given the launch of the AI Safety Institute. And we had a public deliberation on this and have put forward a recommendation that passed through the committee and is now on NIAC.gov or ai.gov/NIAC, which basically says that we think as a committee that this is an issue that should be treated quite broadly, that we need to think of a full range of harms of AI when we think about AI safety, that we need to think about the protection of rights as an issue within AI safety. And I think importantly, that AI safety is not a settled science, that this is something that the government needs to invest in order to advance the science and the understanding of how we even evaluate the safety of AI systems within that context. So I'll just...
Well, thank you all, and I'm thrilled to have this panel. Rachel, I'll start with you. This panel is not about our report, but for those that haven't had the time to maybe peruse all of its many sections, could you give a bit of background about how and why this report came together and maybe highlight a few recommendations in the report?
Sure. I think Ben started to talk about this a little, but last year when we started thinking about what we wanted to do on AI, we started talking to people, and the thing that came up over and over again was obviously that agencies should use the existing statutory authority that they already have. But when we looked around, we didn't really see sort of a comprehensive look of what is that statutory authority and what are some ideas for how to use it. So this report is a little different from the work that we usually do, which is usually sort of we take one specific policy idea and we go really deep on how the administration could accomplish it. But we decided here what would be useful and fill a gap is to look across a range of issues and look at all of the statutory authority and come up with a range of policy proposals. So like Adam said, it's a hefty report. It's 120 pages and there are 80 potential ideas that the administration could take action on. And I think one thing we want to be clear about is we're not saying the administration should move on these tomorrow. We think they probably all need more thought from a policy perspective and a legal perspective, but we thought it was important to sort of fill that gap since everyone agrees we should be using the authority we already have to sort of start to say, okay, here's what we mean when we say that, and here are some examples of how it could be used. There are a lot of great ideas in the report, I would say. I think Director Chopra highlighted some from the financial regulation space, thinking about sort of AI cloud providers as utilities and recognizing the role that they take in the marketplace and regulating them accordingly. I think we have a lot of great workplace ideas that come from my colleague Reed Shaw. One in particular that I'm excited to think more about is putting binding regulations on federal contractors. I think the federal government has a lot of authority over federal contractors who make up a fifth of the workforce. And there are a lot of steps that we could take to make sure that we are protecting workers' rights to organize and generally through the federal contractor space. I think one thing I would say about a lot of the recommendations generally, I think if you read the report, which we hope you will, you'll notice there are a lot of recommendations about data disclosure. Something I think is interesting is at GFI, we usually think of data disclosure as sort of a weak recommendation, as something you do when you don't know what else to do. But in this space, we think it's really important for a few reasons. The first is we don't have a ton of information right now about how AI is being used. A lot of the information we have is sort of anecdotal, and being able to shine a light on how AI is being used, we think in and of itself is really important and can give agencies more information as they're moving forward. But the other thing is that we are recommending in a few places, so for example, around benefit determinations, that you have to include information about how the decision is being made. So information about the algorithm. And one thing that I think people who, monitor this space closely will say is a lot of people involved in the development of AI can't always answer that question. And so we think in this space that data disclosure has a little bit more teeth and is an important first step.
And I will say, I think my favorite of the many recommendations, they're all, our little children in the scenario, is that intersection between in the workplace between employer surveillance and management, or ESAM, and its potential applications on FCRA, on the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which I think is really interesting. MB, Workshop has a phenomenal toolkit, an organizer's guide to executive action, which everybody should go and read after this. It's an amazing primer if you're involved in advocacy. And in it, you have kind of 10 lessons for advocates, and lesson 2 is learn the process, the players, the roles, and the authorities. And I think one of the key rationales for this report was to try and unlock that actual authorities that might be leveraged to address AI. Can you explain to our audience, though, particularly those that might understand AI maybe more than agency authorities, why it's so important to be familiar with the process, players, roles, and authorities?
Thanks for the question. There's several stories of this in Toolkit. I'm going to choose one to share. We had one case where LGBTQ advocates brought to us a proposal for a change that could be made to the FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, to make it possible for a lesbian mom to be there for the birth of a child, or a gay dad to take off time because his child had cancer. This is before there was a marriage decision, right? And so LGBTQ parents had no rights. When I organized this meeting, the advocates came in. They had this very concrete proposal that had looked very carefully at the sub-regulatory language of the FMLA, and the career staff's eyes just lit up. They understood what they were talking about. They understood what the proposed solution was. They also felt really respected, like, you're speaking my language to me. And it was this very actionable proposal. It also came to us from 3 different advocacy organizations. So it meant the outside groups were organized with themselves, and there was consensus around the fact that this would be a good policy to get done. It got done, right? It got done. So the difference between good ideas and things that get done often are a really good, well-researched draft. There are so many good things to do that government will not get done. And this primer that you guys have discovered, again, as I said, democratizes it for advocates so they have access to that. It's also going to be an incredible tool to appointees who do not have the time to do this kind of research that you all did these past many months. So it's really, really powerful, super useful. I will also say I had plenty of people come to me with ideas that they were passionate about and they thought we needed to do, and they pounded on the table that we must do it. And they had like a big idea, but nothing concrete. And it was very rare that something comes out of a meeting like that, right? So this is really, really important. Can I just to pick up on what Rachel said though too about the government-wide, and Rohit also talked about this needs to be an all-government approach. The Biden-Harris administration, like no other, has been an all-government approach to workers' rights, right? Like championing workers' rights like nothing before. The recommendations in this report largely are like for DOL. You could do others for EEOC, for the enforcement agencies, the labor enforcement agencies. I would counter this worker-centered approach is the responsibility of all agencies, agencies that procure services, agencies that let out contracts. Workers are working on those contracts. Are they getting paid? Are they not getting paid? Are union busters getting utilized in those campaigns? Are worker safety things being violated because of AI? Like the power of the purse in so many of these other agencies is huge. Sometimes more powerful than the enforcement agencies. And so that kind of approach that Rachel's recommending, I think is key.
Janet, Director Chopra and Dr. Nelson talked about how AI is really forcing agencies to reckon with the need for technologists. They talked a little about the cross-government hiring initiative. Your organization, Data and Society, recently released a report arguing how critical it is to have socio-technical expertise in the AI age. Can you talk just a little bit more about why such broad social technical expertise is critical, particularly these federal agencies that may be in charge of regulating AI?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm going to start actually by picking up on MB's point, because I think where we have to start is defining what socio-technical means. It's a term that's been thrown around a lot, and I think it's not entirely clear what we're looking for. So we actually put out 2 primers. One of them was an attempt to define socio-technical in the context of policy, and one of them was an argument for why we need more socio-technical talent in government. So what we mean by socio-technical is exactly what MB was talking about in thinking about a workplace environment in which AI is being used. That is, we are thinking about viewing a technology and the society around it as a coherent system. These are not separate, and we can't really regulate a technology without understanding its use within its own context. And that context can be different. It's different to have an AI in an Amazon warehouse than it is to have it at your doctor's office when you're having a scan of some sort. So we also need to think about the context, and that's inherent to a socio-technical approach. And the reason why that's important is because a technology in the real world, outside of the lab, outside of a company, when it hits the real world, when it shows up in your kid's classroom or in your workplace, it's a product always of both a technical design and of broader societal forces, like organizational bureaucracy, like human labor, the human labor practices that MB was talking about, like social conventions. How do we interact with it around other people as opposed to if we're alone? And very, very much power relationships. This is a really big part of it. So the reason why we need to have that kind of expertise in government is because AI in the real world is embedded in these large social institutions. And technical assessments, which is a kind of default position for how we approach AI. We look at maybe its efficacy or its technical structure is really insufficient for understanding from a government perspective how to enact a duty of care for people. We can't have a human-centered approach to AI governance if we don't think of it within the social context that it's being used. And so I think, one of the key places that we're seeing this, and I think Director Chopra talked about a number of really, really important kinds of hiring that's happening across the government. Another one is the hiring of chief AI officers. So most of the agencies through the executive order and the OMB memo are mandated to hire chief AI officers. And that is going to be, I think, a really important role and a really important site in which we see that kind of socio-technical approach play out. So when we think about who's coming into that role, the kinds of perspectives and experiences and expertise that they're bringing, what I'm hoping is that we will see people coming in who have that very socio-technical perspective.
That makes a lot of sense. Rachel, one of the questions we got when we were talking to people about this report was, why aren't you looking at this other agency? And aside from the fact the report was already 120 pages long, how would you hope that others who care about issue areas or agencies we weren't able to address, how would you like them to look at the report and learn from it?
Yeah, well, I mean, a big reason is so the CAP editorial team didn't kill us. But I think we really think that this should be done across every agency. I think we chose the ones that we did just as a starting point, and I think we'd be eager to help think through what authorities other agencies have available to them. I think what we hope the report sort of shows is maybe a way of thinking about regulation in a space like AI. I think everybody in this room probably knows this, but when Congress is going to legislate, they can pretty much do whatever they want within the bounds of the Constitution. Agencies, on the other hand, are creatures of statutes, and so they have to have statutory authority in order to do anything. And so I think what's important when you're working on a space like AI is to have a really clear sense of what the problem is. And I think this was one of the reasons it was so great to work with the CAP team with their policy expertise and really like strong understanding of the AI space, and helped us really develop like, here are the clear problems that we're trying to solve. And then our team could look at, okay, here's the existing statutory authority that we have. Here's what we can do with that. So I would really encourage people to think about that sort of framework when you're developing policy. I also think, that being said, as I mentioned before, we're not saying that any of these recommendations should be done tomorrow. I think all of them probably need a bit more thinking behind them, and we would be eager to work with anyone to flesh them out. So we would love to be in conversation with any of you about ideas that you think are particularly promising, whether there are ideas in here that you think miss the mark, or again, if there are agencies that we didn't look at where there's more that we can do. But I think we, like Director Chopra, think this is urgent, and we want to take some next steps on AI quickly, and are eager to work with people to do that.
And I think one of the things we did while writing the report was we tried to look at a statute and say, here's one or two things we could do with it, but we were by no means exhaustive, right? Like, now that you've
No.
identified that statute, we would hope that folks can look at that and maybe be more creative than.
And if there are problems that we missed where there is a concrete problem, we can always go back and look at the statutory authority again and say, here's how this statute could be used to address the problem.
I'm going to ask two more questions, and then we're going to be able to take audience questions both in the room and on Zoom by, I think, using the Q&A box on Zoom, and we'll have microphones. So stay tuned. MB, a question for you. We have this technology. It's moving super fast. A report shows there's a bunch of authorities that can be used to address these risks, but a lot of these authorities can take years to undertake and finalize, and then the courts step in. Kind of what words of advice do you have for the advocates who are beginning this long process for AI to prepare them for what could be a pretty long effort to get this implemented?
It's going to be a long effort, but I would say, like, coming from labor land, it took 40 years to get the silica rule done. So, buckle up, and we're in this for a while, but that's okay. I would say what you've got, again, praising you've democratized this information. You're right, also creating a roadmap for what other people could do with other agencies. So what you've got a list of are could do's. The work next is to figure out kind of the must do's. And some of that will be in engagement with advocates and real workers and people on the ground impacted. And some of that's going to be engaged with agencies to really think through which solution would make the most different for the most people or the most impacted people. There can be lots of different ways to measure impact, right? Which things are possible to really implement? And that's going to be a dialogue and back and forth with agency staff, because some things sound really good on paper, and then you realize, oh yeah, and then, you know, this is how that worked on the last 3 policies or the last 3. I was loving you guys for putting a TEAGLE in here for the unemployment system. There's a bunch of acronyms that like only labor nerds totally love, right? But you got to really assess what happens to most TEAGLEs. A lot of them go to a center in the States. A lot of them end up in a circular file, right? So it doesn't mean it's a bad idea, but you're going to want to really assess where can we have the biggest impact? Where would people really implement? And also, where is this in the self-interest and a problem that the agency is already trying to solve? I think one of our biggest lessons in Toolkit is you never want to just be bringing another problem to solve. You want to be thinking about what is the agency or what is the White House trying to solve? And this is part of their solution. I am going to help you solve your problem. And they're going to know things that they're working on in the inside that we don't know yet, right? So it's a real give and take and a lot of dialogue, I think.
Janet, last question before we go to the audience. You wrote recently about the OMB AI guidance memo that, and I quoted this because I really thought it was great. Optimism is warranted because the OMB memo represents an important stance that other branches of the U.S. government, particularly Congress, should emulate. AI in the here and now can be governed. To govern AI means that as a society, we can set rules about how it can be used in consultation with the people most impacted by those decisions. We can create systems to enforce those rules. Why is this concept of AI being governable so important for us to believe and understand? We hear a lot of rhetoric that kind of seems to indicate the opposite. And what would you tell those authorities with these existing authorities to start best internalizing that belief that AI is governable?
Yeah, well, so I think we're fighting against, a very long history now, 25 years of the tech industry essentially saying, we got it, don't worry. And that is a really, really strong cultural anchor for us. Google started out with the with the motto, don't be evil. And I think that really guided the approach to regulation around technology for many, many years. And it's still something that I think is tricky to kind of undo. It's a really strong cultural assumption. And to be honest, we still see that. We still take it kind of seriously, maybe not. When we see, the large language model companies say, don't worry, we are on the election disinformation issue. We've got that. And I think what history tells us is that's just not true. We have arrived at this point where government needs to govern. And government's role fundamentally is to protect people from harm. We have ample evidence that these systems may have great benefits for humanity, and I think that they do, but they also bring great harm. And I don't think that it's a question of having to balance between those two things. It's a question that we need to mitigate and prevent the harms before we can reap the benefits. And so I think that the stance that we really need to look to the agencies to take is one that sees themselves as governors of these systems, that sees that as a core responsibility where they need to use all of their authorities. And the report provides a great roadmap for that, to protect the American people. And I think the second thing, and I want to call back to Director Chopra because I thought his point on this was great, is that there's a real need to build the actual infrastructure of governance, to hire the people, to put in place the process. But it's not just that, it's also a culture change. We also need to see technology as governable and see it as legitimate for government to play that role.
Absolutely. We'll take some audience questions now, either in the room or also online. Feel free to submit them. And I believe there is a microphone as well. Yes, the blue shirt. And I always encourage people to questions, not statements, are preferred. And I may interrupt you if it starts to veer too much into a statement, not a question.
So my name is Tony Hausner. I'm retired from the U.S. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. I'd be interested to know what are some of your key recommendations related to healthcare and artificial intelligence?
Well, one thing I think Ben mentioned, we actually didn't include healthcare on this report because HHS was the only agency that was responsive to the Trump OMB's request that they look at their own existing authority and take action there. That being said, I think there are sort of documented examples of how AI can be a problem in healthcare around racial equity and things like that. So I think it's the same sort of issues we see across issue area, and our recommendations would line with that. But Adam, I don't know if you have anything to
I mean, I think maybe I'll throw Jen. I'll say one thing on the healthcare front or the health and medicine front is we hear it rhetorically deployed as the future of real benefit, right? We're going to find new drugs and new cancer, but and we would hope that that is true. I am skeptical to see where the dollars are flowing, and I'm much more worried those dollars are often flowing to systems that maybe automate the ability to turn down people trying to get healthcare or services or things like that. And I think that's a big fear that we see in that deployment. But I'm not sure if others.
I think what I would say about healthcare is that particularly in that area, we need to be really, really aware of the data sets that AI models are being built on top of. Healthcare information and healthcare data is notoriously discriminatory. And if we are building AI systems that are using those data sets as their undergirding, we are only replicating and reifying those inequities.
I will say one last thing, which is things like the healthcare or those systems tend to have a data feedback loop, right? It requires reporting or other things. And so much of in the social media or other worlds where we've been in the dark is there's not that data transfer. It's one of the reasons why it's so much in our report as a recommendation is because we just don't have a lot of that independent data loop on various pieces. I think it's really critical. Yes, in the white shirt.
Yes, I think there was a report that done every year by HAI out of Stanford, and they look at how much money is being spent by whom. And I think Google spent 192 billion, and the government spent maybe 2. And it's always going to be behind. And the pressure's on the government to actually reach into the goodie bag of artificial intelligence to handle backlogs of cases, all kinds of things administratively there, where the workforce is not able to keep up. And you were talking about the data sets and how many hundreds of millions of dollars it takes to create a data set. So government's not going to be creating its own. They're going to be buying everything off the shelf. So they're going to be in an awkward position of both being the consumer and the regulator. And and expertise is going to be is not going to be in the government. The technology speed is just way behind, So what would it even look like for there to even the semblance of a regulation that would be applied to AI?
Well, I think Janet maybe has a good sense of some of the deployment of commercial and other technologies. I think the two things I will say is a lot of that money is being spent on compute, which has not necessarily been as true in the history. I came up in the Web 2 era, and the proportion of money we spent on servers when my first tech job was not equivalent to what they're spending on servers now. But I think the question of how do we develop expertise is one that I think I throw to the audience.
Well, I would say, first of all, that whether expertise is in the government or outside the government is a choice. That's not something that is a natural state. It's a choice for how much the government decides to prioritize this as an issue and decides to put money behind bringing expertise into the government. Yeah, it costs money. And, you know, that is a choice. And that choice hasn't really been made in a significant way that indicates that there's real concern for the actual harms that we're seeing. In terms of, I mean, I think all of us could probably name, you know, a kind of legislative agenda that we'd love to see enacted, but for, you know, maybe I would start with data privacy, comprehensive federal data privacy. Notice an explanation of the use of an AI. If an AI is being used, you should know and you should be able to understand how it's making a decision about you. Systems of contestability. If an AI makes a decision about you that you disagree with, that there's a way for you to contest it all the way through and seek redress. And that there is an ongoing expectation and requirement of both auditing of systems, that they do what they are saying they are doing, and of impact assessments. That is, what is the impact of that system in the world, particularly on historically vulnerable groups. So that would be mine.
The one other thing I would just add is that it kind of goes back to your question of federal contracting. Sometimes we do this thing where we act like, you know, the other side or whatever has all of the power, right? And we're like outgunned. A lot of these big tech companies are federal contractors. They want business with the federal government. Like they want data from the federal government. There's a lot of things they want from us. And so we have to be thinking about what that power relationship is and how do we use the power we have and not leave it on the table.
Absolutely. We're going to take a question online, and then I saw another question in the back as well next.
Yeah, so from our online audience, can you talk about how your recommendations or your hopes for AI regulation address civil rights concerns, for example, discriminatory algorithms in mortgage applications, education, or student loan funding?
Yes, I would say the report includes chapters on the Department of Education where we highlighted some concerns, including, for instance, the use of LLMs to provide information about your student loans, right? If LLMs are hallucinating at a fairly large rate, and one of the things we know that really screws up people who have student loans is bad information about how to deal with them or discharge them or the, you know, other aspects. So I think that's one thing. And I think certainly a lot of our recommendations on the financial sector and the housing sector involve mortgages. I think more importantly, kind of core to all of the report has been civil rights as something that is tangible, right? It is workers, it is people buying houses, it is people getting an education. And I think that fundamentally has to be the approach. It's been the approach, I think, of this administration as it thinks about civil rights, but it absolutely has to be centered when it comes to thinking about technology.
And I think one thing to add that Janet was sort of getting at here is the idea of if we have AI that's making decision based on data that we know is racially discriminatory, makes it even more important for people to know when AI is involved in decision making, which goes back to the data disclosure we were talking about. And I think also we did try in a lot of recommendations to have a built-in review process for these decisions. So around benefit determinations, if you're denied a benefit and AI was involved in that decision making, what is the recourse? And one of the things we recommended was review by a human being as a right that people have related to that.
And just that the civil rights implications in the labor space and in this report are huge, right? The OFCCP cases are typically about, right, an employer that refuses to hire Black applicants or refuses to hire Latino applicants. Like there's again, a long history of employer discrimination in hiring, promoting, retaining, and that's a huge space for this.
Absolutely. There's a question back there, and then we'll do one over there.
Thanks. Hi, Jed Miller, Three Bridges. MB talked about how well the report democratizes a black box, not a technological black box, but the older one, right? The regulatory and governmental black box. so much of the work of democratizing this kind of information or of making it translatable across disciplines is it happens right at the moment of innovation and then in the debate and the money grab and the power grab that follows. And then it kind of silts back down and we all go back to our kind of disciplinary kind of monastic cells and talk in the way we talk. Is there a way with something as urgent as AI and the fact that it is so popular, like the FTC just has this great comment out about advertising and turning AIs into anthropomorphic creatures and how dangerous that is for the public imagination. But if the democratizing work or the good translating only happens in these moments of debate, how do we embed it more deeply into ongoing practice, ongoing dialogue across, say, research and policy or advocacy and tech companies? Where would, in a hiring surge, where would something like that sit? Or is it just an organizational culture question with no answer and we just can't democratize across? You know, how would you begin to solve that for the long term?
That's a big question.
Well, but can I just say, like, this is going to sound really old fashioned, but, you know, CAP and GFI did this report together, right? Workshop collaborates with both CAP and GFI on issues that we're working on together, right? Like, so it's some of this is how we choose to be in relationship to each other, playing to each other's strengths and making it add up to more. I think that's part of it. It's like building the relationships in this room and the ways that we keep ourselves committed, and who else is not in this room, who else needs to be in this room. That it's an organizing question, I think.
Also, this is not a fully formed thought, but I would say that one thing I think we try to do at GFI is I think sometimes lawyers can be sort of an anti-democratizing force. I think a lot of times when lawyers say something can't be done, that's kind of the end of the discussion if the legal work hasn't been done to sort of push back on that. And so I think that's one of the things we try to do is arm policymakers with a response if there's a lawyer who's saying something can't be done. And I think maybe more of that type of work, like more of assuming that you I'm not exactly sure how to say exactly what I mean, but more work to make sure, like MB is saying, that legal analysis is available for people earlier in the process and things like that.
Hi, Jed. I think what I would say, I agree with all of that. Those are very thoughtful answers. I mean, I think that your question gets to a gap in the overall conversation that we're having, which is that I don't think we have a strong base for this work. I think to your point that we need more organizing. I think you're absolutely right. And I think it needs to be even broader than organizations, unions, organized labor. I think we need to be thinking about how to bring people broadly into this conversation who are encountering artificial intelligence in their lives and don't really know how to navigate it and are feeling uncomfortable with it. And I think we have seen that with the introduction of, ChatGPT into classrooms, into kids' lives, into families, where parents and teachers and kids are all trying to kind of figure out how to get at it. I think we see it in so many different kinds of workplaces. And I think there are many other cases. Nurses are a huge force in this because we're seeing AI systems being integrated into hospitals, for instance. And, my organization did a really fascinating piece of research on a system called Sepsis Watch, which was an AI sepsis detection system that we did with Duke University Medical Center. And what we found was it just totally upended all of the workflow, all of the power relationships between nurses and doctors and patients. And, and it really changed the way that nurses experience their jobs. And so I think those are the kinds of which I would say goes back to the question of socio-technical research and why we really need to understand the ways that these systems engage with people and people engage with these systems, because that's where the power and agency really sits.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time for questions, so I'm gonna throw to Janet and be for any final words, and then Rachel's gonna close us out. Any final thoughts? Don't have to. Just-
I want to echo Director Chopra's point that this is really an urgent issue. It's been brewing for a long time and it really is urgent. I also think the flip side of that is it's not really specific to AI. This is really fundamentally, it's not even about technology. It's really about power.
Microphone.
Say again. This report by CAP and GFI is just a treasure trove. So for folks who are interested in this topic, really look at this report and look at the methodology of this report, because I think what you innovated here is an approach that could be used on other issues as well, right? Of what you did here in terms of democratizing the info. And the other thing that I would just add is for folks who are really, really focused on AI, ask yourself the question, where are workers in this issue that I'm looking at? Because I promise you they are there. They are there in the impacts and they can be there in some of the solutions.
All right. Well, I won't keep anyone for too long. I did just want to thank you all for coming. Thank Director Chopra and Dr. Nelson and MB and Janet for a great event. There were a lot of people involved in this report. As I've said, it was 120 pages and it came together over a series of months. So I won't be able to thank everyone, but I wanted to just quickly thank Adam and Ben and Nicole at CAP for being such great partners on this. I wanted to thank the CAP editorial and design team who took a very dense report and made it much better and much easier to read. I wanted to thank Todd Phillips, who's here, who wrote the really excellent chapters on financial regulation. And then I also wanted to thank my team at GFI. I feel a little weird being the GFI representative up here because, as I said, the report took a number of months and I spent most of them on parental leave. So the report really, really came together thanks to my team here. So Reed Shaw, Anna Rodriguez, and especially Will Dobbs Alsop. I think it is a really tremendous resource. I hope everyone will read it. And it represented a large amount of work. I'll just leave you with one thought on AI, I think, of one thing I hope people take away from this event and the report. And I think it goes to Janet's point about optimism, as well as something that's been brought up a few times here. I think tech companies and sort of new technologies have done a really good job of making us think that they're so different from anything that's come before and that they're so complicated that we can't understand them. And I actually think this goes to the democratization point. I think that's part of the reason that there isn't sort of democratization of this. It's happened across a range of industries that I can think of, you know, the gig economy, cryptocurrency, social media, where they think that they're so different, they're so unlike anything that's come before. People can't understand, they can't be regulated. And I think what we tried to show in this report is that that's just not true. I brought up the idea before of the Supreme Court being skeptical of old statutes being used to regulate new problems. And one thing I'd point out is that a lot of the problems we're talking about here aren't new. It's the exploitation of workers, racial discrimination, and how we can use these authorities that we already have to go after those problems in the context of AI. So I hope that makes everyone feel hopeful that regulation in this space is possible. And like I said before, we're viewing this as a jumping off point in our work on AI. We'd love to collaborate with anyone on anything that you all are working on. If there's ways that we can be helpful in thinking through existing statutory authority, we're always happy to do that. So thanks again to everyone being here and watching online. It's been a great event and we've really enjoyed having you all.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.